As we have seen in the video on the aesthetic revolution, the emergence of effective aesthetics had already redressed the balance between reason and feeling. So where in straight neoclassicism everything had to be based on reason, now suddenly feeling becomes central or more important. So because to experience the aesthetic qualities of an artwork, one needed to feel. But this also meant that artworks are understood to be able to recreate feelings, and not only recreate feelings in ourselves, but recreate the feelings of someone else. And this human ability, this is a fundamental human ability that we have, that we can imagine, recreate the feeling of someone else. This ability was at the core of another revolutionary concept that was developed around the middle of the century, and that is the idea of sensibility or sentimentalism. So sensibility basically means this ability to put oneself in another person's shoes, to feel what someone else feels, and out of that comes also of course an understanding and a sympathy with that person. So sentimentalism for us today is probably mainly a pejorative word to something that is overly emotional also. But that wasn't the way that it was used in the 18th century. Here it was tied much closer to this idea of our moral sense. So there was a development in philosophy that looked at the impact of feeling in judging what's right and wrong. Because one thing that writers on morality and ethics found out is that similar to the laws of aesthetics, it was very difficult to use rational and logical argument to prove that something was morally right or wrong. Take this example here from David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. He says, take any action allowed to be vicious, that is agreed by everyone to be vicious. Willful murder, for instance. Examine it in all its lights and see if you can find that matter of fact or real existence which you call vice. You never can find it till you turn your affection into your own breast and find a sentiment, a feeling of disapprobation, which arises in you towards this action. Here is a matter of fact, but it is the object of feeling, not of reason. It lies in yourself, not in the object. So that which you pronounce any action or character to be vicious, you mean nothing but that from the constitution of your nature you have a feeling or sentiment of blame from the contemplation of it. So these are the two observations, that first you can't prove something is good or bad by logic alone, but yet we all have a rather intuitive grasp, or at least most of us have an intuitive grasp of what is right and what is wrong, and that has something that rather emerges out of a feeling. And this was the idea that we have a moral sense, that we have an innate feeling of the rightness or wrongness of an action. So this is moral sense theory, this basically this conflagration of moral philosophy and the claims of effective aesthetics. Because so first of all, it says that human beings are not inherently egotistical and selfish, but rather have this predisposition towards sympathizing with others, this ability to imagine what others feel, and therefore to choose the right with this moral sense. And we do this in real life situations, but where the arts and where literature comes in is that we can train this moral sense, because obviously not everyone has the same kind of moral sense. We don't feel identical about ethical situations, moral dilemmas, and there's no sort of absolute agreement on that. So one idea that people develop then is that you need to put yourself in situations where you can train this. You can find this, for example, in Percy Shelley's famous Defense of Poetry, as is a core romantic document. But this is sort of a final step in this development of the idea that we train the moral sense through exposure to literature. This is what Shelley writes. The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our own nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person, not our own. So going out and identifying with something that is not us. A man, to be truly good, must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause. Poetry strengthens the faculty which is the organ of the moral nature of man in the same manner as exercise strengthens a limb. So by exposing yourself to poetry and to many of these situations, you will exercise your mental moral sense. Shelley here talks about poetry, but for Shelley, poetry really means all kinds of poetical engagements with artistic engagements with reality. And obviously, we have to say that the mode of writing that best is able to put us in someone else's shoes is narrative. We can see this emerge particularly in the writing of Samuel Richardson, as I tried to show, how that is really one of the things that he brings to narrative prose, this identification, this closeness with the main character, and how we are forced to feel with and then for this character and sympathize for the character, and how that also is sort of a major plot point in the development of the novel. But it's really in the wake of Richardson and in the second half of the 18th century that this mode of writing, the sentimental, becomes a fashion and becomes something that many writers develop. And I just want to present you with what is most likely the pinnacle of this exercise in the sentimental, and that is Henry Mackenzie's novel The Man of Feeling, a pure specimen of the cult of sensibility. It centers on this character Harley, and most of the episodes that we see serve to illustrate Harley's delicacy of feeling, his sensibility, how able he is to pick up other people's emotion and to react strongly to these emotions, usually with tears. And tears really fall abundantly in this novel over distressed orphans and veterans, over ruined women, unexpected kindnesses, a trusty old dog, the romantic melancholy of a shepherd's home, etc. and etc. Just a few examples to show you sort of how that this point of the excessive sentimentality is driven home. As he spoke these last words, his voice trembled in his throat. It was now lost in his tears. He sat with his face half turned from Harley, as if he would have hid the sorrows which he felt. Harley was in the same attitude himself. He durst not meet his eye with a tear. So constantly in this novel, Harley gets exposed to narratives, people who tell him their stories, and then they're overcome by emotions about the telling of the story, but then Harley, as the listener, is also overcome by emotions. And of course, all of that are signals for us as readers that we are also supposed to feel these emotions, and we should go along with these. Again, though this story was told in very plain language, it had particularly attracted Harley's notice. He had given it the tribute of some tears. So there's this idea that you, as the recipient of such a narrative, owe your sentiment, your feeling, as a tribute. You give it the tribute of a tear, which means you pay in your own emotions. And it goes on like that. She stretched out her hand to Harley. He pressed it between both of his and bathed it with his tears. So the tears really become the physical manifestation of sensibility, and they flow to an astounding and frankly unrealistic degree. One thing that I think is interesting is that what we can see here with this taking it to its extremes, we're actually getting to the limits of the ability of the sentimental mode to achieve that which it wanted to achieve. We remember it comes out of a didactic idea of it can train us to be better persons by being sympathetic to other people, but the cult of sensibility and of people of sensibility, of men of feeling, basically also meant that it got to the point where you either had it or you didn't, and if you didn't, there was no way you could. Just look at this example here, where the narrator says, "We would attempt to describe the joy which Harley felt on this occasion. Did it not occur to us that one half of the world could not understand it, though we did, and the other half will, by this time, have understood it without any description at all." So either you have already felt it, and then I don't need to describe it, or you will never feel it no matter what I am describing. So here, really, sentiment becomes its own purpose, and there is it sort of disconnects from this original idea of moral instruction, and that is, of course, a move towards the apolitical, towards the non-didactic that we will see later on develop further in Romanticism. While the Man of Feeling is certainly the most extreme example of late 18th century sentimentalism, the most famous and most popular expression of this was a text by Laurence Sterne, his A Sentimental Journey from 1768. It was based on Sterne's own travels to the continent, and he took one of the characters of his earlier novel Tristram Shandy, not Tristram himself, but a minor character called Yorick, who both acts as a stand-in for the author and as a persona that signifies sentimentalism. In the preface, which is characteristically not at the beginning of the text, but somewhere in the opening, but not at the very opening, Yorick distinguishes his own motives and his methods from those of conventional travelers. He says, I will travel, but in a different way, because I am a sentimental traveler, which basically means that he's not going in order to see important sights or to meet important people, but rather he's looking for occasions to feel something, to get into situations that will affect him emotionally, and where he can be sympathetic with people that he meets. So Yorick is not interested in routine tourist sites, but in occasions for the liberation and for the cultivation of his own psychological responses. That also means that there's no plan. There's no plan to the traveling. He's literally just, because someone says, "Oh, you've never been to France," the next sentence he's hopping on a coach and going to Dover to go to France, and then he's on, and he has no plan where he goes, and the storytelling is the same way. It's completely disorganized and episodic. We can look here. This is the beginning of the table of contents. It's not the whole table of contents, only the beginning of it. And you can see that it really makes no sense. The same setting, it's organized by settings, like travel accounts often are, but in a strange way, in that settings reappear, that we're suddenly in a désobligation, that's a type of coach. And then, as I said, this is where the preface comes in, which he writes at that point in the coach. And then we're back to Calais and in a street. So all of this is trivial. This is not; these are not great tourist sites, but rather moments in his experience. So in fact, the unity depends not so much on the plot, but rather on the controlling consciousness of Yorick, who both exposes and analyzes his own emotion. And he creates these situations that give him time to reflect on his action, either in the situation or later on. One very well-known episode is when he meets a monk, a begging monk, who comes to his door to ask for money, and he gives him nothing, because he had been in a bad mood at that moment, but he immediately regrets it once the monk is away. This is when the moral sense kicks in. He gives all of his reasons for not giving money, but immediately he feels that, oh, this was wrong, and he feels terrible about that. So later he meets the monk again, and he exchanges snuff boxes with him as a way to compensate for this, and then that gives way to an outburst of feeling again. This is the scene. "You shall taste my snuff," said I, pulling out my box, which was a small tortoise one, and putting it into his hand. "'Tis most excellent," said the monk. "Then do me the favor," I replied, "to accept of the box and all, and when you take a pinch out of it, sometimes recollect it was the peace offering of a man who once used you unkindly, but not from his heart." Right? It was only his mind that sort of got in the way of his better nature, and his heart wasn't in it. The poor monk blushed as red as scarlet, another physical manifestation of sensibility and interiority. "Mon Dieu," said he, pressing his hands together, "you never used me unkindly." "I should think," said the lady, "he is not likely." I blushed in my turn, but from what movements I leave to the few who feel to analyze. So similar rhetorical argument that those who will understand me, and I don't even need to analyze this for the others. So at the center of all of this, there's sensibility, which is also addressed by the narrator as sort of this central thing. "Dear sensibility, source inexhausted of all that's precious in our joys or costly in our sorrows, that I feel some generous joys and generous cares beyond myself, all comes from thee, great, great sensorium of the world." And this brings us to Sterne's major contribution, his most important work, the novel Tristram Shandy. And this is after this series of 3 novels that I sketched earlier to show how the novel develops into the form that we recognize today. This is an important contribution in that it is in many ways a contradiction to those developments and sort of a counter movement to all of these. So in a way, it is the novel to end all novels. The Life and Opinion of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, or Tristram Shandy for short, was published by Sterne over a series of years in 9 volumes, published between 1759 and 1767. And it is at once one of the greatest novels ever written, and an elaborate proof on the impossibility of writing a novel. Before the novel ever reaches a definitive form in its historical development, and before it develops a really clear convention, this book already destroys most of those conventions in a playfulness that really foreshadows postmodernism. There are many arguments to say that Tristram Shandy is really the first postmodern novel, although it comes some 200 years early for that. We can relate Sterne to the traditions, to these 3 strains of realist narrative that we've identified in the writings of Defoe, Richardson, and Fielding as well. There is the empirical emphasis on actual reality. If you remember, that was Defoe's contribution. We see that Tristram Shandy really is an encyclopedia of the culture, manners, and knowledge of mid-18th century England. This book is chock full of details of everything that makes the life and culture of 18th century England. So it's a good reservoir of knowledge about that time as well. It's also a long book. Then we have the emphasis on narrative's emotional immediacy and impact that we saw as something that Richardson contributes. And Tristram Shandy draws heavily on the sentimental that I have just sketched, with frequent direct emotional appeal to the readers, with frequent scenes that are supposed to work on our emotions, or that at least comment on the mechanisms of sentimentalism. And then finally, we had that strain of that comes with Fielding, with his creation of a narrating mediator, right? Fielding, who sort of pioneered that auctorial narrator. Now, in Tristram Shandy, we have Tristram actually telling his own story, so he's not a sort of a god in his narrative world. He's actually a character in it. But what he does is he excessively comments on the act of narration. This is a highly self-reflective book in which the narrator constantly thinks about the fact that he's now trying to narrate his life, and now he's trying to create this book. And it continuously questions its own status, its own performance. It questions the fundamentals of representation. I'm going to give you one of my favorite examples for this, how it in an extremely playful manner talks about the possibilities, but also the limits of different media in representing something. So there is a scene where his uncle Toby, who is a major character, falls in love with the widow Wadman, and at that point the narrator wants to describe the widow Wadman. Says, okay, how am I going to do this to make to do justice to her, because of course my description only will reach so far. Says, okay, I got a great idea. You just take pen and paper, or take a pen, and you draw the widow as the most beautiful woman that you can imagine, and then it will be right for you. And then so this is that passage up here, and then the next page is just empty. This is the place where you're supposed to draw your own sketch of the widow Wadman, and then he continues on. So he makes clear this question that he's debating this question of whether writing, for example, can represent something like unambiguous beauty. And we talked about the fact that taste means that we can disagree about beauty. So this is a nice way of commenting on that. Another thing that Tristram Shandy is notorious for is its breaking up of linearity. All of the conventions of linearity are undercut in a way. Though it is a novel and an autobiography, although a fictional one, its development is anything from but progressive. The usual idea is, of course, you start at the beginning and then you tell the story as it develops. But instead, the narrator comments again excessively on his own inability to keep a straight line. He says, I just can't follow one line. My plots look actually different. And he actually represents, again, graphically on the page how his plots look alike. So this, what you see here, this would also be part of the original, how the page looks like in the original, that he would include these doodles of, well, these are actually my plot lines that go all the way and that digress frequently. And in fact, readers can get easily lost in the tangles of the narrative when you're trying to piece the things together, because he will constantly digress and constantly get from one thing to another and never get around to come back to what he was originally telling. And that, of course, is basically his life story, which doesn't get all that far in the development of the story. To make some sense of how that works, we can think in terms of time frames that the narrative actually covers. So supposedly, of course, the main time frame is the life of Tristram Shandy, which starts from his birth, and this is where the book starts, although it actually starts a little bit earlier because it starts at his conception. But he doesn't get very far in this. So that starts in 1718 and only gets him to 1723, so when he's 5 or 6. So this is this time frame here. The major story, and this is when he sort of starts to digress and say, you know, in order to understand this, we've got to go back a little bit. And then this is when he starts to tell the story of his uncle Toby and the widow. And this is, in terms of the temporal development, by far the largest part, right? This is this part here, which everything is stuff that happened actually before his birth. And then there is the third element, as I said, his reflection on his own situation in writing this. And this is him here. This is the process when he starts writing, and he continues writing. It takes time for him to continue writing. There's actually this point when he starts to calculate and says, okay, now I've spent so much time, so and so much time to write my life, and actually I spent more time writing it than the actual time that I'm narrating. So that means I will never be able to finish, because by the time I catch up, I have lived so much more that I will need to talk about, that there's just no mathematical possibility for me to finish this novel. So digressions, non-linearity become central themes of the book, together with interruption as sort of another way to break the linearity. And that happens both in terms of the structure of the whole book, in terms of the narration, but even on the syntactical level, that sentences interrupt themselves and become labyrinthine in themselves. So I'm not going to lie, this isn't an easy read by any means. This is a long book. It's has a dense writing style, but a very interesting writing style. You can learn so much about the 18th century, and it's very, very funny as well. I mean, it contains so many incredible scenes and ideas that it is definitely well worth trying to get through it. I'm just going to show you one example of this sort of interruptive style on many levels, also on symbolic levels, of course. As I said, Tristram says, I can't start with my birth. Actually, if you want to understand who I came to be, we have to go all the way back to my conception, because the idea, of course, at the time was that the circumstances of your conception would actually determine your character later on in life, and the major circumstance of his conception is an interruption, and this is what happens. So the scene is the Shandy, Tristram's father and mother are in bed, and because there has been sort of this family ritual where they sleep together once a week, and at the same time, at the same sort of point in time, he usually winds up the grandfather clock, that these two ideas have come associated in the mind of his mother. So one thing sort of brings up the other. And this is to see, pray, my dear, quoth my mother, have you not forgot to wind up the clock? That's the interruption. Good God, cried my father, making an exclamation, but taking care to moderate his voice at the same time. Did ever woman, since the creation of the world, interrupt a man with such a silly question? Pray, and this is the reader, this is sort of a stand-in for the reader, asking the narrator, pray, what was your father saying? And now this is the narrator again saying, oh, nothing. He wasn't saying anything, he was doing something. So the digression are, of course, more than just a gimmick. They really carry a lot of the actual meaning of what Tristram Shandy is all about. They are, of course, an opportunity to display his learning, often his arcane learning, to involve the reader in intricate mazes of related ideas, and to pursue paths that lead away from the narrative line. But the digression is also a way for Sterne to build into the form of his work his primary insight about communication, and that is that it takes place best by indirection, and that the surest way toward comprehension is not the straight line of reason, but rather the parabolas and the zigzags and roundabouts of feeling. So reason works in a straight line. Logical reasoning tries to go in a straight line, but intuitive understanding, and understanding that works with feelings, is something that works by indirection, by association. And the mind probably doesn't work. We're not calculators. Our minds do not work like computers or calculators, but rather through these mechanisms of association, digression, and sort of moving closer towards our target. And this is what he actually echoes and mimics. And in this way, this is also, of course, part of this whole strand of writing that is concerned with sensibility and sentimentalism and feelings as something opposed to clear-cut but also too cold reasoning. So in conclusion, Tristram Shandy is a compendium of 18th century thinking and feeling, one of the most intricate and fascinating and difficult novels ever written, the culmination of everything that went before and a foreshadowing of so much that was still to come. It's also, of course, a text that is basically impossible to adapt to any other medium. There have been very interesting attempts that necessarily need to fail, but the failure to do justice to the book is already part of that exact kind of investigation into the ability of media to express something. So there is at least one movie version that is definitely worth watching as a companion to the book. And then there's an incredible graphic novel adaptation by the great Martin Rowson of the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy that does a very good job of transposing this self-reflexivity and this digressive nature to the medium of comics. So Tristram Shandy in itself was sort of a digression here, something that comes out of sentimentalism, but goes far beyond that. So let's return just once more to the topic of sentimentality and sentimentalism proper, and look at an interesting question now. Now, first of all, sentimentality seems to be apolitical because it puts feeling over reason, and reason, of course, reasoning is the dominant discourse of political theory. Political theory was usually voiced in the form of reasoned analytical observations. It's also a move from the social to the smaller sphere of the domestic, often a concentration of immediate experience, of individual experience, so not an analysis of larger social structures. And even the moral aspects seem to be devoid of social analysis, since it is much more about personal feelings than about what is right in general. But sentimentality brought forth a highly influential fusion of its own theory, of literary representation, and the rise of female writing. And that was the debate around slavery, or to be more precise, about the slave trade. So to understand that, we need to have a little bit of background about slavery in Britain. Now, since the beginning of the 17th century, there was no official slavery in England, in contrast to the Americas, the colonies, of course, where slavery continued until the middle of the 19th century. In 1772, actually, a court ruling officially makes slavery illegal in England. So it's illegal to have slaves, and someone who sets foot on England is actually immediately free, because there is no slavery in England. But then that is important. The slave trade remains. And this is where the triangle trade comes in, and you here see sort of a representation of that triangle trade. So what happens is that the ships start in England here, and they go to Africa, and there they bring manufactured goods, textiles, rum, and other manufactured goods, and they trade that for slaves. So here they load up on slaves, and they bring the slaves to the Americas, to the plantations, where the slaves are being exchanged for the raw products like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. And these products are then brought back to Europe, where they can be manufactured. So that means that no slave ever touches British soil, which would immediately make them free, and yet the merchant profited immensely from that trade. Now here is sort of a flash of contemporary history. You might have seen these images of the statue that is being toppled in Bristol, because that was one of the persons who profited immensely from that slave trade, and Bristol actually was the major port for the slave trade. So this is still a remnant of this. This is how it works, and this meant that even though Britain on the surface could say we don't have slavery, we don't have that, they still profited from that, and it was definitely an extremely inhuman trade with very, very inhuman conditions on those slave ships. So here you can see a depiction of how those slaves would be housed in these slave ships, how much or how little space they would actually have, because they crammed these ships as full as possible, full well realizing that a certain percentage and a large percentage of them would die on the passage, and that was calculated in, that was factored already in. Now the image that you see is a contemporary image of abolitionist people who tried to abolish the slave trade as well as slavery. So around 1783, there is an abolitionist movement that starts in England, especially among Quakers. There are several petitions that are brought to the government and that are successively turned down in 1788, 1791. And this is when also writers started to engage in that struggle. And one of the leading figures, political figures of this was William Wilberforce, a politician who campaigned for the abolition of slavery. And there were also images like this one here. This was the major image of sort of the icon of the abolitionist campaign. This supplicating slave kneeling and asking, as you can see here on the bottom of the image, asking, "Am I not a man and a brother?" So asking whether his humanity shouldn't be recognized. As I said, writers contributed to that struggle by publishing, by writing. For example, here Anna Letitia Barbeau, one of the leading poets, writing this epistle to William Wilberforce. This is actually a poem on the rejection of the bill for abolishing the slave trade, where she praises his efforts towards abolition. There's a very, very good and informative movie about that, about the abolition of the slave trade and Wilberforce and also many of the writers behind that. The movie's called Amazing Grace because that song plays a large role in the abolitionist movement that came out in 2007 on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the actual abolishment of slavery, which will happen in 1807. And that brings us to sort of the contribution of sentimentality and writing to this, because it made it possible for women writers to enter into a political discourse, which was a genre that they were usually kept away from. It was heavily frowned if women were to publish political essays. But female writers against slavery could use this notion of empathy, of feeling with the slave, to evoke the suffering of the slaves and to justify their own participation here. Here, for example, just two lines from an anti-slavery poem by Hannah More. The dire victim torn from social life, the shrieking babe, the agonizing wife. So to evoke the suffering, and this is also part of this "Am I not a man and brother?" To show that the slave can suffer and that I can feel that suffering. Once I admit to the real existence of that suffering, I have to admit the humanity of the slave. In a way, the slogan of Black Lives Matter is a very similar thing, to say to acknowledge the humanity of someone and say, yes, you matter. So here it's mainly through the idea of the suffering and making us feel the suffering, and that's of course where this whole mode of writing of the sentimental becomes heavily political and actually has a lot of impact to get people to think about this and to not just see this in terms of economics and numbers and whatnot, but to actually see human beings and to see that this is an injustice that is being done. As a side note, another way that women participated in the fight against slavery was through one of the first, or I guess the first product boycott. Now, as you heard, one of the things that came from the plantations was sugar. So the idea was that sugar is sort of tainted with the blood of the slaves. So people refused to use sugar as a way to boycott the slave trade, or they would then start to consume only sugar that wasn't made by slave work. So here, for example, you have a quotation from politician William Fox, who said, "They may hold it, sugar, to our lips, steeped in the blood of our fellow creatures, but they cannot compel us to accept the loathsome portion." There were actually sugar bowls that this is basically sort of the first fair trade label that says, well, this is East India sugar that is not made by slaves. So people could consume as sugar that would not contribute to the slave trade, and there were a number of them. So in this way, anti-slavery writing also worked as a way towards women's emancipation, because slavery gave women an opportunity, or the fight against slavery gave women an opportunity to gain a voice in favor of freedom, of emancipation, and against oppression. They did this by metaphorically identifying with the victims, and they could do that because they were women, and women were supposed to be more emotional and more sensitive, so they could say, well, as a woman, I feel with the victim. But of course, similar aspects also apply to their own situation. So implicit in the appeal to empathy is the claim of equality, right? Am I not a man and a brother like you are? And this, of course, partakes in the larger discourse about freedom that also evolved in the French Revolution, for example. So when Hannah More asks, in slavery, does then the immortal principle within change with the casual color of a skin? That is just sort of one argumentative step away from saying, well, does it change with your sex? So this was a way to get into this discourse about rights and freedoms, and we see that then emerge, for example, in writers like Mary Wollstonecraft. We can see this shift towards from a general discussion of rights towards women's rights in an exemplary way in the life of Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the leading thinkers of her age, who reacted to a text by Edmund Burke. You might remember Edmund Burke as the first to systematize the sublime, but he was also one of the founders of conservatism, particularly through this text, the Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he deplores what was going on in France and basically says, well, the age of chivalry is gone, and now everything is going to deteriorate. And this provoked a lot of radical writers in England to react. Among them, Mary Wollstonecraft, who in 1791 answers with a vindication of the rights of men, so a general treatise against Burke on the sort of the grounds of the French Revolution. But she follows that in the next year with a vindication of the rights of women, and that is one of the founding documents of modern feminist theory and feminist activism. It basically comes 100 years too early. Her reception sort of doesn't take off right away, but she is an early example of how out of this debate of general freedom comes, of course, also the debate of equality, both in terms of racial equality, but also in terms of gender equality.